So excited to be with you this morning and to have the opportunity of sharing this passage. I love the passage that we're going to be looking at this morning. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. I think we're going to, there we go. We've got it on the screen up there. This is my own translation that I'm reading from, but follow along in your translation. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, and when they had run out of wine, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." And Jesus answered her, "Woman, why are you coming to me? My hour has not arrived yet." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars sitting there, the kind used for Jewish purification, each holding about 75 to 115 liters. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies." And they did. And when the master of ceremonies tasted the water that had become wine, he had no idea where it had come from. But the servants who had drawn the water knew. And the master of ceremonies called out to the groom and said to him, "It is common practice to set out the fine wine first, and then, when people have become a bit tipsy, the cheaper stuff. But you have held back the fine wine until now." Jesus did this initial sign in Cana of Galilee and shone his glory, and his disciples trusted him. Back in January of 2024, I awoke one morning. Pat and I live out on the UBC campus, and as I was lying there in just kind of the wee hours of the beginning of the day, I suddenly heard kind of a ringing sound. And it was a bit loud, getting louder, and it did not go away. And so I went to my doctor that week and just said, what is going on with this? He said, "Well, actually what you have is called tinnitus. It's a very common condition." How many people in the room this morning have tinnitus? Yes, I feel your pain there. And so I went to the audiologist and eventually got hearing aids, because what happens with tinnitus is you have this lessening of hearing, normally in one of your ears, maybe both of them. And what your brain does is it fills in the gap of what it thinks it should be hearing with a sound that is communicated to your brain. So you're not really hearing a real sound. It's something that's generated by your brain. And for a lot of people, this is a very challenging situation. But what the hearing aids do is they raise back up your level of being able to hear so that your brain doesn't feel the need to have the ringing take place, and it kind of masks a bit of the ringing. And it's worked out pretty well. I call these my Batman hearing devices rather than hearing aids. It sounds cooler. But what happened when I initially found out about this, I did what I often do in these kind of situations. I went to YouTube to try to learn more about this condition so that I could understand it. I asked experts. My brother's a medical doctor, and I called him and I talked to him about the situation. It's a natural thing to do, but it's not always the best thing to do, and it certainly is not the first thing that we should do. And the question that I want to ask you to think with me about this morning for a few minutes has to do with the needs in our lives. Some of those needs are very small needs. You can meet a particular need by going onto Amazon and finding the thing that you need to fix that thing in your office or in your kitchen or whatever is going on. But some of us here this morning have really, really big pressing needs, if we're honest. Physical needs, emotional needs, maybe a broken relationship with somebody that is just eating you up inside. Some of us have needs this morning that are financial. You've gotten into a situation, it's very easy to imagine here in expensive Vancouver, where you're feeling tremendous pressure in life because of the bills that are piling up and the financial needs that are crying out. Most of us need a friend. We need closeness in this society, which is given more and more in North America to loneliness. We need guidance. We need endurance. We have all kinds of needs that we're dealing with this morning, and we all need perspective on how to deal with those needs. So what is your crying need right now? Kind of lock that in. Think about a particular need in your life, and I want you to kind of track that with me as we look at this passage this morning. The question is, how are we responding to our needs, and especially how are we responding to our needs in relation to Jesus? In John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, Jesus steps into a moment of very practical need. And there are three things that I want us to see in this passage this morning. We're going to talk about our need, the cry, and the glory. So thank you very much for the song, those of you who led us just a moment ago, because it's perfect for what we want to talk about this morning. So first of all, let's talk about our need. Our need. Again, the first part of the passage in verses 1 through 3 reads in this way. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When they had run out of wine, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." Now, I love the fact that Jesus' first sign, according to John, has to do with a wedding. Don't you just love weddings? I mean, weddings are such happy occasions. About 18 months ago, our daughter got married. Thank you. Yeah, she's beautiful. She looks like her mother, thankfully. And we just had a ball at that wedding. They are often elaborate, happy occasions, aren't they? And it is phenomenal that what Jesus does, what is presented as his first miracle, is he steps into a situation that really is a crisis situation in this very happy, practical kind of moment. Jewish weddings of the time normally lasted about 7 days. Accompanied by his friends and the bridegroom went to the bride's house where the wedding ceremonies were to start, and then the wedding party went to the home of the bridegroom. So you had the bridegroom coming for the bride and taking the bride back to the place where the wedding was going to take place. Think about Jesus coming for us at the end of the age to get the bride, right? The fact that Mary is named first in the story and she gives instructions to the servants suggests that Mary had a significant role in the celebration. It may be that Jesus and his family were either relatives or close friends of the people who were getting married. And some rabbis of the time thought that it was a special honor if you had kind of a rabbi. Of course, rabbis would think this. But if you had a rabbi and their disciples come to your wedding, they were often honored guests at the wedding. That was kind of a big deal to show hospitality to prominent teachers of the time. So a scholar like Jesus and his disciples would have been kind of important coming to a wedding like this. Wonderful feasts were prepared, just like with our wedding celebrations. And wine flowed. Wine was a big deal at weddings because it was representative of God's gift of joy. And so running out of wine at a wedding in the first century was a massive social faux pas. It was something that you just didn't want to do. It would be humiliating for the family, the bride, and the groom. It would have been a social crisis. It would have been embarrassing, putting a cloud over the whole dynamic and the festivities. When we had Anna's wedding, one of the things that happened in the middle of that was the food that was being prepared for all of the guests sitting in kind of the banquet hall that we had there. We had been assured that all of the food would be able to be prepared in a half an hour. And an hour and a half later, we still had some guests who were sitting there waiting on, being served and that kind of thing. So that was tense for us as the parents who were kind of overseeing what was going on. It all worked out great, and they got married, and it was just so exciting. But back at this time, if you had the wine suddenly run out in the middle of the festivities, that was seen as something that was just not acceptable. And then what happens is Jesus steps in. I love this tapestry, which is an African piece of art here. It is something that I love because Jesus isn't super obvious. Can you find Jesus in that portrayal? Most artwork depicting the wedding at Cana have Jesus front and centered with a halo, but not this one. He's kind of a little bit in the background, which I think is really kind of the way John 2 depicts the situation. Many of the people at the wedding aren't really thinking about Jesus. I think in this particular depiction, that this is probably Jesus and his mother. She's kind of leaning in, and he's got his hands up, pointing toward the wine, the big jars that are sitting there. But I think it's appropriate that this depiction shows an image where the Word through whom all things came into being, including dirt and vines and grapes and fermentation and thus wine, is not obvious to many of the people who were there. But John knew who Jesus was, and Mary knew who Jesus was, and you and I know who has come to this wedding, and the need of the moment was wine. Now, I want you to go back to your need, go back and that need you zeroed in on just a few minutes ago. And I want you to think about how you are processing. Where is Jesus in the picture as you think about your need? Is it something that you just kind of don't even think about? Many of our small needs, of course, we're not saying, okay, Jesus, which of these things on Amazon do I need to pick here? We might be doing that, but with bigger needs, do we sense immediately the need to turn to Christ and say, Lord, ultimately, you are the one who has the ability to answer all of the dynamics going on here with my emotions and the situation and the people that are involved? Is it our impulse to turn to Jesus in that situation? And the challenge is that for most of the big needs that we have, they don't get answered immediately. And we live in kind of this tense in-between space. The word liminal means a space in between, a liminal space, a space in between the need as it's presented itself in our lives and the answer to that need. And even if we're living in trust and turning to the Lord, it's still kind of a tense place to be. Just prior to my tinnitus diagnosis, in the fall of 2023, I was at a faculty retreat over on Keats Island and woke up about 1 o'clock in the morning and had this very strange kind of distended place on my abdomen that was rigid and was about 7 inches long. And I was feeling so physically strange and disoriented. And so I went back to my doctor, and doctor's office is not too far from here. And he said, well, I'm going to get you in immediately. So I went right to him. He was very concerned. He said, the only thing that you've got in that part of your abdomen is your gallbladder and something else. And he said, this is deeply concerning. I think he thought I had a cancerous mass in my abdomen. And he said, so I'm going to get you in to have it scanned right away. When I went to have that scan done, again, which is right here in the immediate area of Vancouver, the young lady came in and did the scan, and she said, okay, I'll be back in just a few minutes. And she stayed out a long time. And when she came back, after talking to the radiologist, she said, you need to see your doctor immediately. And I thought, okay, here we go, Lord. And on my way driving home, my doctor called and said, it's your gallbladder. And what had happened was I had what is technically called a gigantic gallbladder. That little pear-shaped thing had extended to 7 inches. I had 6 golf ball-sized stones in my gallbladder. This is a very unusual condition, as you can imagine. And my doctor got busy. He found someone who could do the surgery who was very good, but it would be 3 weeks out. And as you know, gallbladder rupturing is a life-threatening kind of situation. So my wife didn't let me have any fat at all. If a can of something said like 0.005% fat in this, she just wouldn't let me have it because that's what activates the gallbladder. I called my doctor brother in the States and I said, so David, I'm not going to be able to get surgery for 3 weeks. He said, is that reasonable with what I have going on here? He said, well, I guess it is in Canada. He said, if you were here, it would already be out. But the reality is, I love our system here in Canada. And by God's grace, it all got taken care of. The surgeon was amazing. They did it laparoscopically, got that thing out. Isn't that crazy that they can do that? I have pictures if you'd like to see. But I want to tell you that 3-week space, I was constantly before the Lord in that in-between space and saying, oh God, my life, it's right here in your hands. And during that time, I wrote a poem that kind of went like this as I was coming into this time of having surgery for this gallbladder. And it has just resonances of waking up in the middle of the night, being afraid that you may be able to identify with. This liminal space yawns like a giant that would consume me, that could undo me if I let it. How it woos me to embrace a cynical fear of the shadowed unknown, so grown out of all that is reasonable. To trust in such times comes hard won, no fun at all, the doubts playing with me like a mouse on a string, jerking one way and then the other, oh bother, the midnight fatigue. Yet I perceive you, Lord, standing there, my vision blurred. I cannot see those looking on unaware of your identity. I'm tempted to fear your infinity as if it gives you little ability to see me in my aching need. And yet, you have been born across a greater liminal chasm of need than I could ever bear. Indeed, you are always so much more than I can see and give more than I could ever need, and in the end, really are all I ever need. And yet, in this in-between, oh, how I plead, please, in my pleading, help me to trust. It's not easy to settle into trust, is it? When you're threatened. Yet sometimes God is working out our good and His glory in those in-between times of great need, for He is bringing us to Himself that we might participate in a moment that shows His glory. So where do we begin with that? Where do you start if you find yourself this morning in that place? Well, we start, of course, by doing what Mary did. We come to Jesus. And so I want us to talk about the cry just for a minute, where we come and we cry out to Jesus. In verses 3 through 5, we read, "When they had run out of wine, Jesus' mother said to him, 'They don't have any wine.' And Jesus answered her, 'Woman, why are you coming to me? My hour hasn't arrived yet.' And his mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.'" Now, in the face of this really embarrassing situation for the wedding party, Mary does the most reasonable thing in the world. She comes to Jesus for help. Jesus is always our greatest need. In The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis writes, "He who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God alone." And yet, at first blush, Jesus doesn't seem to come off as very approachable in this story, does he? The way that he responds to Mary can feel a bit cold, like he's rebuking her, right? But what we have to do is we have to look at this term where he turns to her and he says, "Woman," and then follows that up by saying, "It's not yet my time." If we do good Bible study here and we actually look at how that address is used elsewhere in the Gospel of John, it's used 5 other times in the Gospel of John. Speaking to the woman at the well, Jesus told her, "Believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." He's in a dialogue publicly with a woman, which was kind of forbidden in that culture, just from a cultural standpoint. And yet he's treating her as a dialogue partner, respectfully. Second is in chapter 8, verse 10. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" This is the woman who's been caught in adultery. So it's a moment where he's showing compassion to her. In chapter 19, verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved standing at the cross, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." A moment of tremendous compassion when he's dying and he's handing care of his mother over to one of his closest disciples. And then in chapter 20, verse 13, the angels at the tomb addressing Mary Magdalene, they said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" And then in 20:13, Jesus says the same thing to her. "Woman, why are you crying?" Again, in a moment that's a really, really significant moment. It's not an address of rebuke. These women, the lead witness to the Samaritans, Jesus' mother at the cross, the lead witness to the resurrection, these are roles of tremendous dignity in the Gospel of John. So here's the thought on what's going on here with Jesus addressing his mother as woman in our passage this morning. John in his first chapter has already kind of nodded toward Genesis chapter 1 and 2. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He is very clearly echoing Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He's doing that to point to the deity of Jesus and his role in the creation of the world. But also in that context, in that first chapter of Genesis, you have the creation of woman as the co-bearer of God's image in the creation story. She is co-steward of the world. It's a word that's used in the first couple of chapters of Genesis as a word of tremendous dignity and respect. And I think that when Jesus uses it here of his mother, he's using it with tremendous dignity and respect, perhaps a bit playfully as well, when he says, "And why are you coming to me?" Of course he knows why she's coming to him. He said this, I think, kind of like when Pat says to me, "The neighbors need someone to keep their kids this Saturday." And I say, "And why are you telling me this?" Of course I know why. And of course, Jesus knew why Mary was coming to him. At this point in the narrative, John, the narrator, knows what Jesus can do, and Jesus knows, of course, what he can do, and Mary knows what Jesus can do, and you and I, the readers, know. But the guests at the wedding, they don't know. In any case, it's clear that Mary did not hear Jesus' words as words of rebuke, but rather as a yes. Because when he says that, she immediately turns to the servants and says to them, "Do what he tells you to do." Even as Jesus says, speaking of his suffering and his crucifixion, "My hour has not yet come." And in John's gospel, the hour refers to his passion, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. He was saying, "Mom, it's not time to pour the wine yet." But in essence, Mary hears Jesus' answer to her request as a yes. So again, this morning, in your need, do you believe that Jesus in some way is saying yes to you? That he loves you, he is for you in this situation, even though it doesn't feel like it at the moment. It's very hard, we're in the middle. It doesn't mean that we always get the answer we expected or even wanted, but we can know that he cares about us and our situation, and he is working out our good and his glory if in the middle of it we are yielded to him. If God be for us, who can be against us? Paul writes in Romans 8:32, "He who did not spare his only son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things?" Wonderful promise at the end of Romans 8. So brothers and sisters, this morning in your particular need, right now, turn to Jesus. Make a decision to cast your anxiety, take your cares to him. Cast them on him because he cares for you. And this brings us to our final point this morning, the glory of neediness that we have in verses 6 through 11. Again, that part of the passage reads, "Now there were 6 stone water jars sitting there, the kind used for Jewish purification, each holding about 75 to 115 liters. And Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water,' and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies.' And they did. And when the master of ceremonies tasted the water that had become wine, he had no idea where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. And the master of ceremonies called out to the groom and said to him, 'It is common practice to set out the fine wine first, and then when people have become a bit tipsy, the cheaper stuff. But you have held back the fine wine until now.' And Jesus did this initial sign in Cana of Galilee and shone his glory, and his disciples trusted him." 6 stone water jars. The Greek text says this was 2 or 3 measures, which it says was about what we would say is 75 to 115 liters. So the total for 6 jars is up to about 700 liters of wine. Just think about that for a minute. That's about 930 of our normal bottles of wine. The gifts of Jesus are elaborate, more than we could ask or think. The jars probably were sitting in a passageway leading into the eating area because they were used for purification. As guests came into kind of the banquet area, they would wash their hands as they came in using the water in these jars. That's why they were sitting there, is so that they could go through an appropriate Jewish process of washing before the meal. And so Jesus and his disciples have probably gotten in line to wash their hands. And by this point, the jars could have been depleted a good bit as people were kind of, washing and taking water out of the jars. And so Jesus tells the servants, fill the jars with water and fill them to the brim. And one of the things that I love about this miracle is how unassuming it is. Jesus simply says, fill them up, and then draw out some. No flashing lights. Jesus doesn't stand back and kind of get the attention of the crowd and go, behold the wine. He doesn't do that. It is very, very unassuming. All he did was quietly, effortlessly exerted power. I had a student this past term who was a PhD student from mainland China. We have kind of an exchange program at Region where we have these PhD students from China come in, and they'll be at Regent for a term to have a different cultural experience. And many of them don't know the Lord. This one guy in my class is an atheist. Through the years, the past 20, 25 years, about half of the students who have come to us in that program have come to Christ, which is amazing. But this student wrote a paper on this passage for me, and at one point in the paper he said, of course, we know this cannot happen just with normal physical laws. And I wrote, in commenting on his paper, I said, no, actually it can with a nuclear reaction. Years ago, a guy who was a chemist at the former university I taught at in the States did a talk on this, and he put actually the model on the screen where you had the model for water and then the model for wine. And he said, this is what it would take for this to happen, for this to be transformed in this way. It would take something that would be the equivalent of a lightning bolt worth of power. That kind of energy for it to take place. And so it can happen if you have the power. Paul tells us in Colossians 1:16 and 17, for everything was created by him, speaking of Jesus, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible. All things have been created through him and for him, and by him all things hold together. In other words, every atom in all of creation holds together because Christ has a hold of it. And the creator of all, who worked out the fermentation process that can take time in the natural world, he has the ability to exert the power in a moment of time in this situation and bring about the transformation instantly because he has that kind of power. He's the one who created all the lightning bolts. And so we find something manifested here that is astounding. Jesus changes the water into wine. The master of ceremonies did not know what would happen. Normally, the master of ceremonies was an honored guest who was kind of overseeing everything, and one of his jobs was to make sure that the wine kept flowing. But he's clueless about what has taken place here. He's clueless about it. He is shocked by the good wine, as with my translation. He shouts out across the banquet hall to the groom, but the groom's also clueless. You can imagine when he shouts and said, "Hey, you saved the best wine for last." And the groom is sitting over there going, "Right, yeah, have no idea what you're talking about," right? He did not know what Jesus had done for him. He didn't really know who was in the room. But John knew, and Mary knew, and the servants knew, and the disciples knew. In fact, real disciples of Jesus know what Jesus can do because we learn to trust him in the midst of the really challenging moments in our lives. And what happened in this situation was that it shone his glory. It revealed what he is like as he brought about this transformation. And one of the main uses of glory in the Bible is it's a manifestation of God's presence. And the Word became flesh, and we beheld his what? His glory. He himself was revealing something about his identity. And Paul says that's exactly what happens when in the midst of being beaten up in life, we manifest the glory of Christ in these clay jars through our need, our suffering. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, the treasure of the gospel, relationship with Christ, in order that this extraordinary power might be seen for what it is, power that comes from God and not from us. In every way we are being afflicted but not restricted, baffled but not to the point of despair, abused but not abandoned, knocked down but not terminated. We are always carrying around the dying of Jesus in our body in order that also the life of Jesus might be made known through the medium of our body. In other words, you are the sign that manifests the glory of God. And the irony is, often it is in our moment of need that the glory is manifested. I know that when we are struggling with needs in our lives, it feels like we are flying blind sometimes. But we need to turn to Jesus and trust him, for he is glorious. He has shown himself to you in the beauty of the world. We see that all around us here in Vancouver. He has shown himself to you in the kindness of particular people. Trust him. He has shown himself in, at times, the healing of the sick, either now or in the hope of resurrection. We should trust him. He has shown himself in raising the dead. Trust him. He's shown himself in forgiving sins and transforming lives. We should trust him. He has shown himself in the building of his church. The fact that all of you are here this morning, we should trust him. He can be trusted with that need of yours and mine because he is good and he is glorious and he's working in the midst of what's going on. So this morning, I want to challenge you to turn to him and ask him to make his presence known in your situation and to show his glory. Let's pray together. Our Lord, we thank you very much for the fact that your word is tremendously honest and clear, that in our relationship with you, we are not guaranteed lives free from challenge. In fact, what we are guaranteed is that you will use the challenges of our lives to transform us, to grow us, to teach us endurance, and to teach us trust. And oh Lord, I pray that this morning as we come to you with these very specific needs that each of us has, and some of them are big needs and very intense and hard to deal with, But Lord, you are bigger than all of these needs. And 100,000 years from now, we won't even remember the challenge because we will see your face in glory. And so I pray that we would have the grace this day to move in that direction. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.